September 10th, 1944, Geel, Belgium, 0600 hours. Lieutenant Stuart Hills of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry sits in his Sherman tank, watching the first light creep across the Belgian countryside. His squadron has pushed deep into enemy territory, and the morning feels almost peaceful. Mist hangs in the low ground between the hedgerows. Somewhere ahead, German forces have been retreating for days. The war feels, for a moment, almost manageable. Then the Sherman beside him erupts in flames. Hills watches the commander claw his way out of the turret, uniform on fire, skin already blistering from burns that will mark him for life. The driver never emerges. In the seconds that follow, Hills realizes with cold certainty that he cannot see what killed them. No muzzle flash from an anti-tank gun, no artillery report echoing across the fields, just a sudden violence from somewhere in the hedgerows, perhaps 30 meters away, close enough to hit with a thrown stone. For 2 agonizing minutes, Hills waits. He knows his tank will likely be next. He has the firepower of a medium tank at his command, a 75mm gun capable of destroying a German panzer at 1,000 meters, 2 machine guns that can shred infantry in the open, and 5 men ready to fight and die beside him. None of it matters. He cannot identify the threat. He can only sit inside his steel coffin and wait for the same fate that took his comrade's driver. The strike comes without warning. The blast punches through the sprocket, destroys half the starboard track plate, and fills the crew compartment with searing heat. Hills escapes with a scratch on his forehead. His driver feels the heat on his legs, but survives. They are the lucky ones. Whether you lived or died, Hills would later write, was largely a matter of luck. The weapon that nearly killed Stuart Hills cost the German army somewhere between 15 and 25 Reichsmarks to manufacture, roughly equivalent to a week's rations for a single soldier. A pair of boots cost more. The Sherman tank it destroyed cost the United States government tens of thousands of dollars and took substantial industrial effort to produce. This was the Panzerfaust, meaning armor fist in German, a disposable steel and cardboard tube that changed the economics of armored warfare. By the war's end, it would force tank crews across every front to make the same desperate demand. Do not send us forward without infantry protection. The impossible problem. The crisis that created the Panzerfaust began in the summer of 1941, when 3 million German soldiers rolled into the Soviet Union expecting a quick victory. Operation Barbarossa was supposed to shatter the Red Army in weeks. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in 35 days. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Soviet resistance was expected to collapse even faster. They did not find the victory they expected. The standard German anti-tank weapon at the time was the 37mm Park 36-toed gun. It had performed adequately against light tanks in France and Poland. German infantry trusted it. German commanders built their tactics around it. Against heavier Allied armour, it was inadequate. The British Matilda II, the French Char B1, the Saumur S-35 all proved resistant to the 37mm round. German soldiers watched their carefully aimed shells deflect or fail to penetrate. And when the T-34 appeared on the Eastern Front, the problem became catastrophic. The T-34's designers had angled the hull plates at 60 degrees, causing incoming rounds to ricochete rather than bite. Infantry units gave the Pak-36 a bitter nickname, the Door Knocker, because it announced your presence to the enemy without doing any actual damage. Tank hunting teams resorted to desperate measures that cost lives by the hundred. Men climbed onto moving Soviet tanks to drop grenades through hatches. Others jammed Teller anti-tank mines under tracks at arm's length. The survival rate for these tactics was poor. The Wehrmacht needed a new weapon, and they needed it immediately. The requirements were specific. It had to be light enough for a single infantryman to carry across rough terrain. It had to be cheap enough to produce in quantities that matched the endless waves of Soviet armour rolling westward. And it had to defeat armour that conventional anti-tank guns could not penetrate, using some principle beyond muzzle velocity alone. The answer came from shape-to-charge technology based on the Monroe effect, a principle discovered by an American chemist named Charles Monroe in 1888. Monroe had noticed that when explosives were stamped with letters, those letters were imprinted into steel plates placed nearby. The hollow spaces in the letters focused the explosive force. German engineers refined this observation into a weapon. When explosives are shaped into a hollow cone and lined with copper, the blast focuses into a hypersonic jet of metal particles travelling at 7 to 10 kilometers per second. Faster than any bullet, faster than any tank shell. This penetration is driven mainly by the high-velocity jet and hydrodynamic metal flow, not heat like a cutting torch. The metal behaves almost like a fluid while remaining solid, punching through steel with devastating effect. Development began at Hugo Schneider AG in Leipzig during the summer of 1942. The company, known by its abbreviation HASAG, specialized in metal goods and ammunition production. Engineer Dr. Heinrich Langweiler led the weapons development team. The initial prototype carried the nickname Gretchen, meaning Little Greta. It evolved through several iterations before becoming the weapon that would terrorize Allied tank crews across 2 continents. The first 500 production units left the Schlieffen factory in August 1943. Hitler himself ordered the name change from Faustpatroni to Panzerfaust, preferring the more aggressive designation. German infantry finally had a weapon that could defeat the armour of virtually any Allied tank at typical combat distances, if the firer could get close enough. The only question remaining was whether Germany could produce enough of them before the Allies produced enough tanks to overwhelm the defence. The answer, as history would show, was no, but the killing those tubes accomplished before the end would haunt survivors for decades. The engineering. The Panzerfaust was a study in brutal industrial simplicity, designed from the first sketch to be manufactured quickly, cheaply, and in enormous quantities. The weapon consisted of a steel tube roughly 1 metre long and 44 millimetres in diameter. This tube contained a black powder propellant charge wrapped in paper, requiring no precision machining or complex manufacturing processes. The warhead, attached to a wooden stem that slid into the launch tube, featured the distinctive bulbous shape that gave the weapon its menacing silhouette. Inside that bulb sat the shaped charge explosive, typically a mix of TNT and cyclonite, surrounding a copper liner machined to the precise angles required for optimal jet formation. The entire assembly weighed between 3 and 7 kilograms, depending on the variant. A trained soldier could carry 2 or 3 into battle without difficulty. An untrained conscript, pulled from a factory floor or a schoolyard in the war's final months, could learn to fire one in less than 5 minutes of instruction. The firing procedure required no technical knowledge whatsoever. First, remove the safety pin securing the firing mechanism. Second, raise the flip-up rear sight, which cocked the weapon automatically through a simple mechanical linkage. Third, push the T-bar safety forward to the arm position. Fourth, aim using the edge of the warhead itself as a crude front sight, lining it up with the rear sight at the estimated range. Fifth, depress the pedal-shaped lever beneath the tube. The black powder charge would ignite, expelling the warhead at 30 to 45 meters per second, while exhaust gases vented from the rear opening. Spring-loaded metal fins, folded flat against the stem during storage, deployed upon leaving the tube and stabilized the projectile in flight. Early models were short-ranged and crude. The initial Panzerfaust 30, introduced in August 1943, weighed roughly 3 kilograms and could penetrate around 140 millimeters of armor at an effective range of 30 meters. The designation indicated the range. By September 1944, the Panzerfaust 60 had become the most common variant. It doubled the effective range to 60 meters while penetrating 200 millimeters of steel. This was the weapon Allied tank crews encountered most frequently in the final year of the war. Later versions pushed the range out toward 100 meters and beyond, though these appeared in smaller numbers as Germany's industrial capacity collapsed. For comparison, the Sherman tank's frontal armor measured approximately 50 to 100 millimeters, depending on the variant. Side armor was 38 to 45 millimeters. The Soviet T-34 offered similar protection. The Panzerfaust 60 could defeat any of these tanks from most angles at ranges where the crew might not even see the firer before dying. The warhead created an entry hole approximately 7 centimeters in diameter, significantly larger than the roughly 1.3 centimeter hole produced by the American bazooka. This size difference mattered enormously for what happened after penetration. Larger entry holes meant more devastating effects inside the tank. Massive spalling where fragments of interior armor broke away at lethal velocities. More extensive fires as ammunition and fuel ignited. Higher crew casualties among those who survived the initial penetration. The comparison with Allied equivalents was stark. The American M1 bazooka was usually operated by a two-man team, a firer and a loader who inserted fresh rockets from behind. It could penetrate approximately 76 to 100 millimeters of armor. Effective range was roughly 150 meters, significantly greater than early Panzerfaust variants. The British PI-80, the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, was a spring-loaded weapon that demanded 90 kilograms of cocking force, roughly equivalent to a very heavy deadlift. It weighed 14.5 kilograms and required considerable training to operate effectively. Penetration was approximately 100 millimeters. The Panzerfaust weighed under 7 kilograms, required no cocking, needed only one operator, and could penetrate twice as much armor as either Allied weapon. The disadvantage was range, but in the close terrain where most combat occurred, range mattered less than getting the first unseen shot. Production reflected the weapon's design simplicity. By October 1943, German factories produced 40,000 Panzerfausts per month. Within a year, monthly production reached 400,000 units. At the war's end, with Allied bombers destroying factories daily and raw materials running short everywhere, production still exceeded 1 million units per month. Total wartime production reached approximately 8.25 million units, according to commonly cited figures. The cost per unit remained remarkably low, 15 to 25 Reichsmarks for a complete weapon ready to fire. For the cost of one German tank, the Reich could field thousands of Panzerfausts. This asymmetric calculation explains more about the weapon's impact than any technical specification. The battlefield. The bocage country of Normandy was terrain that might have been designed specifically for close-range anti-tank ambush. Dense hedgerows, some over 1,000 years old, divided the Norman countryside into a maze of small fields bounded by earthen walls, topped with vegetation so thick a man could hide within arm's reach and remain unseen. These walls rose 1 to 2 meters high and extended equally deep into the earth, their roots intertwined with centuries of accumulated soil. Sunken lanes, worn into the ground by generations of farm traffic, created natural trenches connecting the fields. Visibility rarely exceeded 50 meters, often it was less than 30. For tank crews trained in the open desert of North Africa or the rolling English countryside where their Shermans had practiced, this terrain was a nightmare. Tanks attempting to cross hedgerows had to climb the earthen embankments, tilting upward at steep angles that exposed their thin belly armour to any defender waiting on the other side. The 38mm of floor armour was less than half the frontal protection. One well-placed shot from a concealed position meant death. The alternative was following the narrow lanes between fields, where ambush was inevitable and retreat nearly impossible. A disabled tank at the head of a column blocked everyone behind it. A burning wreck filled the lane with smoke and flames while its ammunition cooked off in secondary explosions. German tank hunting teams adapted their tactics with lethal efficiency. Small groups of 2 or 3 men would dig foxholes into hedgerow embankments, covering themselves with vegetation until they were invisible from more than a few meters away. They allowed columns of American tanks to pass, waiting for the vehicles to move beyond effective response range, then fired at the vulnerable rear armour. Escape routes were prepared in advance. By the time the surviving tanks identified the firing position, the Germans had vanished into the next hedgerow. The Panzerfaust's effective range of 30 to 60 meters was not a limitation in this environment. It was perfectly matched to the terrain. Every field was a potential ambush. Every hedgerow concealed potential death. Fox Company of the 2nd Armoured Division entered the hedgerow country with 17 operational tanks. Their mission seemed straightforward on the map. Push through to the objective, support the infantry, secure the road junction. Within days of fighting, they were reduced to 4 tanks. 13 Shermans burned or abandoned, their crews dead or evacuated to aid stations with burns covering most of their bodies. The 3rd Armoured Division, which had trained in England and crossed to France, expecting to fight a mobile war of manoeuvre, lost 632 Sherman tanks across 231 days of combat. This was more than any other American armoured division in the entire war. The division received replacement tanks continuously, burning through equipment at a rate that strained American production capacity. Units cycled crews at a brutal rate. Replacement crews arrived knowing the odds they faced. They climbed into their tanks anyway, they had no choice. The psychological toll matched the physical destruction. Tank commanders reported constant vigilance that exhausted them within days. They scanned every bush for movement. They watched every farmhouse window for the distinctive silhouette of a Panzerfaust warhead. They studied every hedgerow gap for the shadow that might be the last thing they ever saw. Sleep became difficult, then impossible. Men developed 1,000-yard stares without ever leaving their vehicles. Corporal Clarence Smoyer, a gunner who would later fight at Cologne in one of the war's most famous tank duels, described the anxiety in terms that resonated with every tanker who served. Taking a large city gave the enemy plenty of places to hide, he recalled. You fired at anything that moved. That is when a gunner's instinct kicked in, guessing from where that Panzerfaust might come at you. I was scared and always scanning for targets. The Hürtgen Forest, fought from September 1944 to February 1945, was even worse than Normandy. Dense woodland of fir and pine-covered steep ravines along the German border, the trees grew so close together that tanks could not leave the narrow logging trails that wound through the forest. A single disabled vehicle blocked the only path forward. German defenders had months to prepare positions, registering artillery on every trail junction and mining every approach. The 28th Infantry Division lost 31 Shermans and 16 tank destroyers in fighting that gained almost nothing. Total American casualties in the Hürtgen reached between 33,000 and 55,000 men, depending on which units and which timeframe historians include. The 22nd Infantry Regiment lost 3 battalion commanders in 3 consecutive days. Ernest Hemingway, who witnessed the fighting as a war correspondent, called it Parsondale, with tree bursts. He was comparing it to the worst battle of the First World War, a comparison that said everything about what American soldiers faced in those woods. Urban combat produced the highest Panzerfaust casualty rates of all. The percentage of American tank losses attributed to Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks rose from 4% in September 1944 to 14.5% by November. At Aachen in October, the first German city to fall to American forces, tank killer teams armed with Panzerfausts and covered by machine gunners knocked out lead tanks and sent accompanying infantry scrambling for cover in doorways and behind rubble. Analysis of 1st Army tank losses from June 1944 to May 1945 revealed that infantry anti-tank rockets caused 13% of total tank losses, but 21% of crew casualties. The Panzerfaust proved significantly more lethal per hit than other anti-tank weapons because of what happened after penetration. When a shaped charge breached the hull, crew members had seconds to escape before the interior became an inferno. Ammunition stored in racks along the walls began to detonate. Fuel lines ruptured and ignited. Those who could not escape through the hatches in time were reduced to ashes and bones. Recovery teams sometimes found nothing recognizable inside destroyed tanks. If you are finding this interesting, subscribing takes a second and helps the channel grow. Now, let us see how this weapon terrorized the Eastern Front. The human cost. The terror was not limited to the Western Allies. Soviet tank crews faced the same threat from the same disposable tubes, often in even greater concentrations. The Red Army had more tanks than the Western Allies, which meant more targets for German defenders desperate to slow the advance. T-34 crews learned to dread close terrain as thoroughly as their American and British counterparts, knowing that every village, every forest edge, every pile of rubble might conceal a fire waiting for them. The Red Army distributed detailed instruction manuals warning of the Panzerfaust danger. Crews were advised to avoid showing their sides to potential firing positions. Tanks were to maintain intense suppressive fire at trenches and buildings where grenadiers might be concealed. The guidance acknowledged what everyone already knew. There was no reliable defense except killing the firer before he could fire. In open country, the Panzerfaust remained a limited threat despite its lethality. The weapon's short range meant that defenders in flat terrain could not close to effective distance without being spotted and killed. Soviet records from March 1945 show that in the 8th Guards Army, only 7 of 122 lost tanks, roughly 6%, were destroyed by Panzerfausts. The remaining losses fell to artillery fire, tank guns, and mines. The weapon required specific terrain conditions to achieve its potential. Berlin provided those conditions in abundance. The Soviet drive into the German capital in April 1945 became the bloodiest urban battle of the European war. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers advanced against a defending force that included Wehrmacht regulars, Waffen-SS fanatics, Volkssturm militia, and Hitler Youth children armed with weapons they barely understood. The fighting would cost more lives in 2 weeks than many campaigns consumed in months. The city offered exactly the terrain the Panzerfaust required. Rubble from Allied bombing blocked streets, forcing tanks into predictable routes where ambushers could wait. Buildings on every side provided elevated firing positions that tank guns could not easily engage. Basements offered concealment for defenders who could emerge from one entrance, fire at a passing tank, and vanish through another exit into the underground maze of Berlin's infrastructure. Records from the 2nd Guards Tank Army reveal the weapon's effectiveness in these conditions. 106 of 576 disabled vehicles, roughly 18%, were destroyed by Panzerfausts during the Berlin fighting. This was more than triple the percentage seen in open terrain operations. Total Soviet losses for the Berlin operation reached approximately 2,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Total casualties exceeded 300,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. The Red Army paid an enormous price for the final victory, and a significant portion of that price was extracted by teenagers holding disposable tubes. Marshal Rotmistrov, one of the Soviet Union's most experienced armoured commanders, observed that assault groups created during preparation for the Berlin operation effectively fell apart due to the heated fighting. The carefully planned combined arms tactics, developed through years of experience against German forces, dissolved in the chaos of street-by-street combat. Units lost contact with each other. Infantry and tanks became separated. Deputy Commander General Bogdanov complained in his after-action reports that infantry fighting alongside the tanks cleared only the lower floors of buildings, leaving upper floors untouched. This allowed Panzerfaust operators and snipers to fire at the tanks from above, where hull-mounted machine guns could not respond. Soviet tanks learned to fire high explosive rounds into upper stories before advancing, but ammunition expenditure became unsustainable. The defenders of Berlin included some of the most improbable soldiers of the entire war. By 1945, Panzerfausts were issued to anyone who could hold one. The Volkssturm, the People's Storm Home Guard militia, consisted of men over 60 who had been deemed too old for regular service and boys as young as 12 who had been deemed too young. Martin Bormann, head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, explicitly prioritized anti-tank weapon training over rifle instruction when organizing these units. His reasoning was coldly practical. Elderly men and teenagers could not be expected to fight effectively as infantry, but they could destroy Soviet armor with minimal preparation if they were brave enough to close the distance. Hitler Youth training with Panzerfausts began at age 14 in December 1944, as the situation on both fronts deteriorated. By the war's end, boys of 12 served in combat units defending German cities. Girls as young as 14 received instruction in firing the weapon, though fewer were actually committed to combat. Photographs from the final weeks of the war show Hitler Youth members with Panzerfausts clipped to bicycles, riding out to attack Red Army armor advancing on Berlin. They looked like children because they were children. Many died in their first engagement. Some achieved kills that hardened veterans would have found difficult. Training was minimal by design and necessity. Alfons Heck, a Hitler Youth leader who survived the war to become an American citizen and public speaker, recalled that two things they had in abundance were bazookas and Panzerfausts, which were very effective up to a range of 200 yards. Even women were taught how to use them. Volkssturm members trained on weeknights after their regular work shifts and for 6 hours on Sundays, often with no live fire practice at all. Ammunition was too precious to waste on training when every round might be needed against Soviet tanks. Some Volkssturm soldiers only familiarized themselves with their weapons when in actual combat, fumbling with unfamiliar mechanisms while shells burst around them. The human cost of this desperate defense was catastrophic on both sides. Berlin's 40,000 Volkssturm defenders faced 2.5 million Soviet soldiers supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. One Volkssturm battalion that began the battle with 400 men fought until only 10 remained. They had no choice. SS execution squads roamed the streets, hanging soldiers and civilians alike from lampposts for cowardice or desertion. Placards around the bodies proclaimed their crimes. Defenders faced death from both directions. The Panzerfaust itself posed genuine dangers to its users. The lethal zone behind the tube extended 3 meters, where the backblast could kill instantly. A wider hazard zone capable of causing severe burns and shrapnel injuries extended up to 15 meters. Large red warning labels reading Achtung Feuerstrahl, meaning warning fire jet, did little to protect those who had never handled the weapon before and were too terrified to read instructions. Indoor firing was extremely hazardous. The backblast in an enclosed space could kill the firer, knock over furniture, start fires, and alert every enemy soldier within hearing range. Some Volkssturm and Hitler Youth defenders died from their own weapons, killed by the tools they were using to resist. The German soldiers who faced the approaching Allied armies in those final months were not the supermen of Nazi propaganda or the cartoon villains of later cinema. Most were conscripts who had never wanted to fight. Many were children who had been indoctrinated from birth but still trembled when the shooting started. Nearly all were caught in a war machine that offered no exit except death or surrender, with surrender forbidden under pain of execution. They used weapons that sometimes worked and sometimes did not. They died in the same mud and rubble as the men they were ordered to kill. The Panzerfaust made them dangerous, but it did not make them invincible. The Allied response. Tank crews did not accept their vulnerability without resistance. The first countermeasure was improvised armour applied in the field by crews who believed they were improving their chances of survival. Sherman's accumulated sandbags stacked 2 to 4 deep on every available surface, sometimes reaching 170 bags weighing approximately 3 tons in total. Track links from destroyed tanks, both friendly and enemy, were welded to hulls in patterns that crews hoped would disrupt incoming warheads. Timber and logs were lashed to sides. The 2nd Armoured Division troweled wet concrete onto vehicles and let it harden overnight. Crews bolted any metal they could find to their tanks, scavenging from destroyed buildings and abandoned equipment. Testing conducted by ordnance specialists revealed uncomfortable truths about these field modifications. On March 9, 1945, the 1st Armoured Group conducted controlled tests firing Panzerfaust 60s at sandbagged M4 Shermans. The results were not encouraging. Shots against the side armour blew away the sandbags on impact and still penetrated the underlying steel plate. The warhead's shape-charged jet formed correctly despite the sand, punched through the bags as if they were tissue paper, and entered the crew compartment with lethal effect. Only angled shots against the heavily sloped glacis plate showed any protective benefit, and those shots would likely have bounced off the bare armour anyway. Some ordnance experts argued that sandbags might actually help the shape's charge by providing standoff distance for the jet to form more completely before striking the main armour. The Monroe effect worked best when the warhead detonated at a specific distance from the target. Too close, and the jet had not formed properly. Too far, and the jet began to disperse. Sandbags might inadvertently provide optimal spacing. General Patton, informed by his ordnance officers that sandbags were technically useless, forbade their use in his Third Army. His reasoning was practical. The added weight of 3 tons of sand degraded automotive performance significantly, increasing fuel consumption, wearing out transmissions faster, and reducing top speed. Tanks bogged down more easily in soft ground, mechanical failures increased, all of this for protection that might be imaginary or even counterproductive. After the devastating losses at the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945, Patton ordered salvaged armour plates welded to his tanks instead. Steel, at least, had consistent properties. Whether it actually helped remained debated. Soviet crews improvised similarly on the Eastern Front. Some constructed so-called bedspring armour, metal mesh frames welded to tank hulls at an offset distance designed to prematurely detonate Panzerfaust warheads before they reached the main armour. The theory was sound. If the warhead detonated on the mesh, the jet would form and travel through empty air before striking the hull, losing energy and focus in the process. The effectiveness of these field modifications remained disputed throughout the war and after. Some Soviet tankers swore by their bedspring frames. Others noted that many tanks so equipped still burned when hit. The psychological comfort of doing something, anything, may have been as valuable as any physical protection. The primary countermeasure that actually worked was not technological but tactical. Combined arms doctrine evolved rapidly in response to the Panzerfaust threat. Before the weapon appeared in large numbers, tanks had operated with considerable independence. Armoured columns could advance through countryside, secure objectives, and hold ground without constant infantry support. The Panzerfaust ended that independence. Field Manual 1740, published by the United States Army in November 1944, established formal procedures for infantry riding on tanks specifically to protect the vehicles from German anti-tank weapons. The manual did not treat this as optional or situational. It was mandatory doctrine. Tanks did not advance into close terrain without infantry protection. The relationship was made explicit in training documents and after-action reports. Infantry depended on support from tanks for firepower against fortified positions and machine gun nests. Tankers needed infantry to sweep away enemy soldiers and screen tanks from threats the crews could not see from their restricted vision ports. Neither arm could function effectively without the other. The practical application was straightforward once understood. Infantry dismounted from tank decks or accompanying half-track vehicles before the armour entered close terrain. They moved forward on foot, clearing buildings, checking hedgerows, and eliminating potential ambush positions before tanks advanced into the danger zone. Tanks stayed at least 30 yards from structures or vegetation that might conceal a firer, engaging suspected positions with machine gun fire and high explosive shells. Communication improved via telephone handsets mounted on tank rear decks. Infantry leaders could pick up the handset, press a button, and speak directly with the buttoned-up tank commander inside. This eliminated the dangerous need for tankers to open hatches in combat zones. Coordination between the two arms became faster and more reliable. One infantryman offered a tanker's perspective on the uncomfortable arrangement. Those damned things, meaning the tanks, have an awful tendency to draw fire and then catch fire. Riding on a tank made you a target for every weapon the enemy possessed. Riding near a tank was only marginally safer. The relationship between infantry and armour was never comfortable, but it kept men on both sides of the partnership alive. The Cullen hedgerow cutter provided indirect protection by fundamentally changing how tanks move through bocage terrain. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, the 3rd of the 2nd Armoured Division, invented the device using scrap steel from the German beach obstacles that had lined Normandy shores on D-Day. These obstacles, intended to rip the bottoms out of landing craft, were made of angle iron welded into X shapes. Cullen realised that the same tough steel could be welded to the front of a Sherman to create a hedge-cutting blade. The result was a set of 4 prongs that allowed Shermans to burst through hedgerows at ground level rather than climbing over and exposing their vulnerable belly armour. The tank hit the hedgerow at speed, the prongs biting into the earthen embankment, and the entire vehicle ploughed through in a shower of dirt and vegetation. General Omar Bradley watched a demonstration in amazement. A hedgerow exploded before his eyes to make way for the Sherman bursting through. The device was immediately ordered into mass production. Nearly 3/4 of the 2nd Armoured Division's vehicles received Cullen devices, nicknamed rhino cutters for the horn-like appearance they gave the tanks. Before Operation Cobra broke through the German lines in late July 1944, the cutters did not protect against Panzerfausts directly. They protected tanks from the firing positions those Panzerfausts would have occupied. A tank that stayed at ground level instead of climbing a hedgerow did not expose its belly armour. A tank that burst through unexpectedly gave ambushers less time to aim and fire. Speed and unpredictability became protective in themselves. The legacy. The Panzerfaust did not vanish with the Third Reich. Soviet engineers had collected and tested captured weapons throughout 1944 and 1945, recognizing immediately that this German innovation represented a fundamental shift in infantry anti-tank capability. They worked to produce their own design, combining the best features of the Panzerfaust with lessons learned from American bazookas also captured in large numbers. The result was the RPG-2, introduced in 1949. This weapon incorporated the Panzerfaust's simplicity and shaped charge warhead design while adding improved sights and slightly longer range. Soviet infantry carried it through the Cold War's early decades. The follow-up weapon proved even more significant. The RPG-7 entered service in 1961 and remains in production today, more than 60 years later. Its basic design traces directly to principles first weaponized in Dr. Langweiler's Leipzig laboratory. Over 9 million RPG-7s have been manufactured. The weapon serves in more than 80 countries across every continent except Antarctica. It has appeared in every significant conflict since its introduction, from the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan to the cities of Ukraine. American engineers pursued a different development path but arrived at the same fundamental destination. The M72 light anti-armor weapon, designated the LAW, was introduced in 1963. Military historians describe it explicitly as a combination of the two World War II weapons, the miniaturized bazooka principle with the Panzerfaust's lightweight and disposable cheapness. A single soldier could carry the tube, extend it to firing length, aim at a target, and discard the empty launcher. The AT-4, fielded in 1983 by the Swedish manufacturer Saab Bofors Dynamics, continues this design lineage. American forces adopted it as their primary light anti-tank weapon. It remains in service today, still clearly descended from that first disposable German tube. Germany itself returned to the Panzerfaust name after rearmament in the 1950s. The Panzerfaust 44 entered service with the Bundeswehr in the 1960s, a modern weapon carrying an old name. The Panzerfaust 3, introduced in 1987, brings the lineage into the 21st century. The modern Panzerfaust 3 can penetrate up to 900mm of armour using tandem warheads specifically designed to defeat reactive armour panels. It has been actively supplied to Ukraine during the current conflict, where it destroys tanks descended from the same T-34 that inspired the original weapon. History circles back on itself. The fundamental lesson of the Panzerfaust, that cheap infantry weapons can defeat expensive armour, remains relevant to every modern battlefield. An RPG-7 costs under $500 American to produce. A modern main battle tank costs millions. At the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, RPG-7s descended from the Panzerfaust design principles, downed 2 Black Hawk helicopters, triggering the firefight that killed 18 American soldiers and wounded 73 more. The descendants of that disposable German tube have profoundly shaped both conventional and unconventional warfare by putting anti-armor capabilities into the hands of fighters with minimal resources and training. The Sherman crews who demanded infantry escorts were not displaying cowardice. They were responding rationally to an asymmetric threat, a weapon so cheap and so simple that any conscript, any teenager pressed into the Hitler Youth, any elderly man dragged from his home and handed a Volkssturm armband could wield it with lethal effect. Their massive firepower meant nothing against an unseen enemy who needed only steady hands and a clear sightline. The demand for infantry protection was not weakness. It was survival wisdom learned at terrible cost. Stuart Hills lived to record his experience at Geel. He survived the September morning when his comrade's tank burned and his own nearly followed. He survived the rest of the war. He returned to England, married, raised children, and wrote his memoirs decades later when the nightmares had faded but never entirely vanished. 60 years after that September morning in Belgium, Hills could still recall the agonizing minutes he spent waiting for death. The helplessness of sitting in a Sherman tank with all its firepower, a 75mm gun and 2 machine guns and 5 trained crewmen, unable to identify any target or even guess which direction to look. The certainty that survival depended not on skill or training or firepower, but on whether some unseen German in the hedgerows had steady hands and clear sightlines. My mind was full of horrors, he wrote. I had seen at the closest possible range what had happened, and now it was very likely that the same thing was going to happen to me. The Panzerfaust cost between 15 and 25 Reichsmarks to build. It gave Stuart Hills nightmares for 60 years. It forced every Allied tank crew who encountered it to confront a simple and terrifying truth that had been forgotten since the cavalry charge became obsolete. Armour could be beaten, and it could be beaten by anyone.